Oh, hey, look at that.
We are live.
I think we're live.
Calling Chris Anderson in
Holy
London.
cow. I am, thank God, in London. Yes, and calling
And
Rick Byer
and
in
in
Chicago.
Chicago. And we are back live. Woo woo.
Live, I know. It's crazy.
Live. This is not a
Not
this
my
is not
hologram
on
anymore.
tape. I'm in Chicago. My mouth is moving. Welcome everybody to History Happy Hour. We're excited to be here. And thanks to Stephen Ambrose
We
Historical
are, yeah.
Tours for helping bring you the show. Check out their rich offering of military history tours at stephenambrosetours.com. And whether you're watching live, watching on replay, perhaps you're listening on the HHH podcast, we are glad you are here. And today we will be talking about the 1921 Murder Farm Massacre. So please let us know that you're out there and what you're drinking. Oh my gosh, there's a bunch of people who are there already. And Chris,
what are you drinking, Rick?
I'm drinking a beer. I have a nice beer in my PSYOP Change Persuade Influence mug or glass. What are you drinking? And you're frozen, Chris. So Chris has been having some intermittent Wi-Fi problems today. So there he is. Now he's back. Are you back now?
Okay.
I want to thank everybody who
My Glen
supports
Turret.
us. Okay,
I know.
very good. Nice. There we go.
Yeah.
I want to thank everybody who supports us on Patreon, especially our top shelf patrons. Here you are, and you can join this group. There it is. You can join the top shelf patrons by clicking on patreon.com/historyhappyhour. Hey, Chris, I thought that we should do a little show and tell.
Okay.
So why don't we start? Because we've both been away and we've both been doing interesting things, and we have some photos. So why don't you start?
I'm starting. Okay.
Do you want me to put the photo up, or do you want to cue me when you
always
want the
helpful.
photo?
Well, I was on the Pacific. Okay, yes, that is the world's biggest Tamiya model, and shortly after that photograph was taken, we blew it up with firecrackers. No, that's actually the Yamato Museum. That's the Yamato Museum in Kure. So that's where the Yamato is built, and of course, biggest battleship ever built. And they have a wonderful museum there and a tremendously huge scale model of it. So that's me there.
And I have another photo here that you sent.
You do. Oh, yeah. See, I actually had to wear my History Happy Hour hat in the jungle, looking very dapper there. Yeah. That's but that was actually a cool moment. That is the bunker on an island called Nagibus, just off of Peleliu, and that's well known for people who've read Eugene Sledge's With the Old Breed. He has kind of a transformative moment at that bunker. So we went on a little hike through the jungle with machetes, etc., and actually found the bunker, and that was
you look like you're kind of the ring coach for a boxer, about to take on somebody.
Yeah. It was a tad on the warm side there, and so we all had towels to wipe away the sweat from our brow.
Well, I was in Washington a couple of weeks ago for the Ghost Army Congressional Gold Medal ceremony, and here's the official photo of this. We had 600 people there, 3 veterans.
Yeah, that doesn't look like 600 people.
No, they're there on the other side of the camera. 3 veterans. The ceremony was presided over by the Speaker of the House. It was very moving. You'll notice I'm way off on the on the left on this shot, and
I was wondering about that. Yeah, why is that?
And some of the that's just where I ended up. But some of the media photos just cut me right out. So it was like sort of the invisible place. We can make Rick smaller. But the picture I really want to show you was the one I took in the holding room minutes before the ceremony began. And just to say what's in this picture, you've got the 3 veterans are sitting there, left to right: John Chrisman, Bernie Bluestein, and Seymour Nussenbaum. And Seymour and Bernie are in the wheelchairs, and kneeling down and giving them their undivided attention are, again, left to right, General Charles Brown, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Christine Wormuth, the Secretary of the Army, and General Randy George, the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army. So this this kind of moment to me was very, very powerful, that these high and, this high leadership of our U.S. military, not just attending, not just talking to the veterans, but down on their knees to talk to them. And that was really something quite spectacular. Hey, I know we're taking up a lot of part. Yeah. Where's the Air Force? Why wasn't Chuck Schumer there? There are many questions that we can ask. So
another show.
Our guest Earl is sitting patiently by, so we got to get to him. But Chris, quickly before we do we have anybody here we want to say hello to in our audience,
absolutely,
or acknowledge their presence?
Well, Sylvia Ponce Leon has joined us. Stacey Roberts, Liz Mumford, Doug McCord, Brian Peacock, the Templins. So yeah. We got a good show.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. And now we have killed already 5 minutes, so we should get this show on the road. Chris, so why don't you give me a cue?
I think so.
The bar is open. And
the bar is open.
Yes. So we are going to kick off our return to live programming with a dark and powerful story that starts in rural Georgia 100 years ago. It involves murder, it involves a trial, and it involves a national controversy over the treatment of blacks by Southern planters. And this is more than 50 years after the Civil War, but it's 40 years before the civil rights uprisings of the 1960s. And our guest is Earl Swift, whose book, a previous book, was a New York Times bestseller. And he joins us to talk about his new book, which is, which I have here at someplace. I have the cover here. Yeah. It's called Hell Put to Shame, the 1921 Murder Farm Massacre and the Horror of America's Second Slavery. And so, Earl, welcome. Finally, welcome to History Happy Hour.
Thank you so much for having me, guys.
We're so glad you're here. Your story involves a series of murders and a trial that were headline news in 1921, but are pretty much completely forgotten today. So my first question is, how did you come across this story, and what made you want to write about it?
Well, I stumbled on it completely by accident, and because it was headline news back in 1921. I was working in 2007 on another book, History of the U.S. Highway System, and I was looking through, sorry about that train, looking through a...
Didn't you tell the trains to just hold off for this hour?
There's a train track very close by. I could almost feel it rumbling. I was looking for a story in the New York Times on microfilm. I was in the library at Old Dominion University in Norfolk, going through the microfilm reader, looking for a brief about the 1921 Federal Aid Highway Act that I knew had appeared in the Times, very deep in the bowels of the newspaper, sometime in March of 1921. I didn't know which day. And so I was having to go through day by day through this month of newspapers, and kept on running into these front page references to this mass murder in a place called Jasper County, about 40 miles southeast of Atlanta, in which 11 black men had been killed by what appeared to be an unlikely murderer. And the more I read of these stories, the less interested I was in the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1921, I can tell you. And so I started pursuing the narrative through these stories from day to day. And what emerged was a tale that I had no idea. It opened up a whole new chapter of history for me that I didn't know existed. That being that in the years after Reconstruction, throughout the South, a renewed form of slavery took hold with the help often of officialdom, in which almost always men, but men were held in peonage. I saw that word a lot in these stories. I'd never seen the word before. And it means basically debt slavery. It's where we get the word peon. And in this particular case, the form it took is that a young black man would be arrested on a trifling charge, say vagrancy, not having been stopped by a cop without a nickel in his pocket. That was an offense aimed specifically at blacks. He'd be tossed into the local jail. Conviction was a foregone conclusion, and he'd be facing, because he couldn't pay the fine involved, which was $5 or something. He was facing a month or more on the chain gang, and while he was mulling this fate, a farmer would show up in jail and say, you can come work for me. I'll pay your fine. You can work off your debt by coming to work on my farm. Now, most of these prisoners were agricultural workers anyway, so this was not an unattractive offer. They knew the depredations of the chain gang; those were pretty well established. So often they went home with these seeming benefactors, only to find that once they got to the plantations, they weren't as charming as advertised. They were held. They were locked up at night. They were often ball and chained in the fields. They were beaten for any infraction, real or imagined. And if they tried to leave, they were hunted down or they were killed.
I was just about to let Chris ask a question there, and he has.
Well, I could keep going for a while if you like.
Well, I was going to ask. So we'll get to peonage, and we'll talk a little bit about it, and we hope that Chris Anderson will be able to reconnect and rejoin us. We're not sure what the problem is there today, but let me ask you to kind of give us a sketch of how this story begins. Oh, wait a minute, he's right back.
Yeah,
Chris.
hopefully.
All right. So, Chris, I quickly, while you're here, ask a question.
Well, I mean,
Okay.
we're going to get into a lot. Hopefully, I will get into it with you. But one of the things I really enjoyed about the book is just your descriptions of the place. And I want to quote you here. It says, Georgia consistently earned Johnson's attention for the simple reason that it offered a steady supply of atrocity and outrage. No state lynched more of its citizens. None was more a prisoner of its racist past. None offered so much promise bundled with disappointment, horror, and grief. So can you tell us a little bit about Georgia in 1920? What was it? I mean, what is the environment that this story is set in?
Well, it was a number of states rolled into one. You had Atlanta, which was in many ways a pretty cosmopolitan place. It was a southern city of the early 20th century. Make no mistake, this was not a bastion of liberalism by any means, but it was a bustling, sophisticated metropolis, and you need not go far from Atlanta to find yourself in a completely different century, really. Out in the agricultural districts of the state, it was still very much living in the 19th century. This was a mostly unelectrified, a big area without running water, without basic basic conveniences, and in which agriculture was mule driven, and in which sharecropping was probably the number one means of employment for Black people. It was about evenly divided between the races. The state was, and of course, this is a big state. This is the biggest state east of the Mississippi. So it's, we're talking compared to other southern states, a place that exerted some clout in Congress, that was generally regarded, I think, as and my allusion to having so much promise as well as so much disappointment, et cetera, is a recognition of the fact that there were so many things about Georgia that seemed right on the cusp of becoming kind of 20th century, and then the state consistently disappointed its observers, and of course this case being a pretty glaring example of that.
So let's talk about how this story begins. This is a case where the investigation starts before the murders, and may in some ways have led to those murders. So give us a sense of how this gets started, and what rolls it off.
Yeah, the peonage was against federal law. It had been illegal federally since 1867, but it was not enforced by the southern states largely. In fact, southern agriculture relied on peons and on free labor, free agricultural labor.
And I mean, just to on the subject of peonage, I mean, one of the examples you gave is somebody who is working off their debt. They think they've done it on their way off the farm. They're offered an extra shirt or a pair of pants, and they take that, and then, oh, you have to pay that off too. And then it keeps being more and more. He ends up being there for 8 years. So this isn't just work for a month or two and pay it off. This is a way to hold people for a long, long time under the power of the law, working on your farm.
Oh, if you took that offer at the jailhouse and went home with a plantation owner, you would find often that the cost of your food, your clothing, the roof over your head, such as it was added to the fine that the plantation owner had covered, so that the longer you stayed, the deeper in debt you grew.
Yeah.
And it was illegal for you to leave. So the law actually backed up the plantation owner on this. But, that was all a pretense. The plantation owner could just keep you because he wanted to keep you. He didn't really even need, a financial incentive for doing so. The law was always going to take his side. And so, if he just chose not to let you leave, he chose not to let you leave. And you didn't have much to say about it. But getting back to your original question as to how this started, a black man named Gus Chapman staggered one day into the offices of the Bureau of Investigation, which was the forerunner of the FBI, at the courthouse in Atlanta, and reported that he had been held for close to a year against his will down at this farm in Jasper County, and that there were a number of other men that were being held there as well, and that while he was there, he had seen one of his fellow peons murdered before his eyes, and he knew of other killings that had taken place as well. So, you have two federal agents, A.J. Wismer and George W. Brown, who meet with him, take down his story. And peonage was part of the Bureau of Investigation's bailiwick to go out and investigate these cases, but it was not a front burner kind of crime. It was difficult to prove. Even if you were able to build a case, white juries almost always sided with white defendants in the South. And if you somehow managed to get a conviction, the sentences meted out to white defendants were often so puny that it hardly seemed worth the effort. But a second black man, walked into the office of the Bureau of Investigation as it happened and reported that he also had been kept on this Jasper County plantation, and that he had also witnessed a murder while he was there. The murder of a different peon than Gus Chapman had mentioned. And so now you had a critical mass kind of that propelled the agents into a visit down to Jasper County. So on February 18th, 1921, they drove to the John S. Williams plantation. And there's John S. Williams there, 54 years old, father of 12. His oldest son had already left home, was a doctor in Henry County off to the west, but his three next oldest sons helped him manage this 1,100-acre spread of cotton and corn. And agents met with him. He said, look, everybody who's here wants to be here. I run a happy plantation. And gives them a tour of the place to kind of press the point home. They interview several of the farm hands that they see in the fields. And it becomes pretty clear to them that these men are terrified that they won't say a word, and not because they don't have anything to say. And it also becomes clear to them that if they're going to build a case against John S. Williams, they have to figure out a way to get these peons away from the plantation, away from him, so that they can speak freely. So they leave at the end of this visit, frustrated, but having seen enough that they're pretty confident that there is a case to be made. Off they go. John S. Williams, in the days that follow, panics. He's convinced that they're going to come back, that they will be back to take away his farm, that they will put he and his 3 sons in prison, that he'll lose everything that he's worked his entire life to build. But he decides that the only thing to do is to destroy the evidence. And so he proceeds to do that. Over the course of 12 days, he murders 11 men with the help of a field boss he recruits, not a peon, but a black man who actually lived and worked on the farm and had since childhood, a guy named Clyde Manning, who he presses into service by saying, "You don't help me, I'm going to kill you." So under threat of death, Clyde Manning becomes his right-hand man in performing these murders. So yeah, the visit unwittingly precipitated all that followed.
Okay, so but then how does this go then? How does this go from an investigation of this peonage case then to this full-blown murder investigation and trial, and what's that?
Sure. Williams would have gotten away with all of this because these men would not have been messed. They were taken out of jails far from home. Now they're nowhere near Jasper County, most of them, and it was the style of killing that he employed, really, that led to a case being built against him. And that is because instead of merely shooting or stabbing or bludgeoning these men to death on his property and then burying them on his property, he hit on a particularly cruel and strange way to do away with them, which was that he bound them in wire and chain and roped them to 100-pound sacks of rocks and then threw them alive off of area bridges into local rivers. And it increased the chances that he'd be discovered. It was unnecessarily complex and drawn out. And really, there seems only one explanation, and that was to amp up the cruelty and the fear these men felt before they finally died. And he would have gotten away with that too, except that spring the rivers were running low and some of these bodies started coming up.
Mm-hmm.
So they start coming up, and we talked about Clyde Manning. Clyde Manning is working for him, and Clyde Manning is on the farm there, and the agents go back, and they manage to get him. They take him off. They bring him, and they start questioning him in the wherever, in their office or in the county courthouse or wherever, and he eventually just unfolds the whole story, doesn't he? I mean, it's sort of like they don't even realize what they've got, and because they've just discovered a few bodies at that point, and he proceeds to say, well, no, there's these, and then there's these ones, and if you go here, you'll find these ones, and he just knows the whole thing.
Well, of course, he's perpetrated them. He's been Williams's conspirator throughout, unwilling, but conspirator nonetheless. He, they had spoken to him during their first visit, and he had lied to them. So they kind of identified Clyde Manning early on as someone who was particularly close to Williams and had something to hide. And so when they, these bodies were discovered, 3 bodies were discovered, 2 of them wired and chained together back to back at Allen's Bridge in the Yellow River. That's what's left of Allen's Bridge today. And one was found below Man's Bridge on the South River. That's Man's Bridge today. And they fully expected to hear nothing more than how these 3 people wound up in the water. They went into their interview with Manning with no expectation that there would be a broader story that he'd have to tell. And instead, he, after some encouragement, and I mean encouragement literally, he was not beaten or coerced that we know of. He instead told them, the story of these 11 and beyond. He knew of killing that took place years before this spree unfolded. And in fact, ultimately, Williams was connected, although never charged, with another 7 or 8 killings that had occurred.
Above the 11?
Above the 11, yeah. And that may be the tip of the iceberg. This guy could have been doing it for years before. But that was the institutional memory of the plantation. And remember, all these workers are very young, so they don't have a lot of history, any one of them. But they've been told stories. Stories been passed down among them over the years, as one peon comes and tells. He learns from the older peons what the score is. There's a good chance that if you go back to the 1890s and the pre-1910, that there are more bodies still.
But I mean, one of the things that kind of comes out in the book, and it struck me as I was reading it, is Williams is almost surprised that it has even gotten this far, right? And I'd had enough, American history to know that very often the word of somebody like Manning is discounted against a man like Williams. So what is it about this that actually brings this to go as far as it goes? How isn't it just like not brushed under? Because you explained that it's the manner of the killing, but you also say in the book that by this point, somewhere in the neighborhood of 3,500 people had been lynched in Georgia. So, is there something just kind of particular about this case or Manning, or?
Well, the particular thing is that you had federal agents involved. Okay. Now, when they realized once these 3 bodies showed up underneath Mann's and Allen's bridges, the local newspapers in Newton and Jasper counties reported it, and it was picked up as a brief in the Atlanta papers, and that those newspapers wound up on the desk of the 2 federal agents who had gotten this ball rolling to begin with. Okay. And they realized, hey, wait a minute, this is the same neighborhood we just were visiting. They take a trip down to the plantation, see very few black faces around, put 2 and 2 together and realize Jonas Williams is getting rid of his plants. And they recognized at the same time, though, that Jasper County was uniquely hamstrung in its ability to do much about it. The sheriff was John S. Williams's cousin. Williams was reputedly the richest planter in the county. That man had pretty big influence in Monticello, the county seat. He had business dealings with the county prosecutor. He had actually taken out a $5,000 loan from the man and had bought a 282-acre piece of property from him in just a few years before. So there were all these conflicts of interest in Jasper, with Jasper pursuing it with vigor. And another problem was that the feds themselves couldn't prosecute because there's no federal statute against murder at that point. So they realized our best bet in seeing anything done here is probably with the governor. And they went to the governor, Hugh Dorsey, with probably little expectation that they'd have a heck of a lot of luck with him, mostly because he was not known to be the most racially open-minded guy in the South.
Well, yeah, and I don't want to jump in, Rick, and steal a question, but could you maybe talk a little bit about Dorsey, because he's got a very interesting sort of backstory before this all begins, right?
Right, an interesting backstory and an interesting response to this. So, yeah, absolutely. Let's go there.
Yeah, I mean, Hugh Dorsey had been the lead prosecutor at Fulton County and earlier in his career, and had prosecuted the Leo Frank case. Leo Frank was a Texas-born but Yankee-raised New York Jewish guy who was the manager of a pencil factory in Atlanta. And in 1913, the spring of 1913, a 13-year-old employee of the factory was found dead and sexually assaulted in the basement of the factory. And Dorsey put together a case against Leo Frank and railroaded him into a conviction despite very strong evidence that Frank had nothing to do with it. And then, in fact, the state's lead witness against him was a much more likely killer of Mary Fagan, the 13-year-old girl. Anyway, Dorsey, for good or ill, got a conviction and then fought all of Frank's appeals right up to the point that the governor commuted his death sentence and had it switched to life in prison, at which point a lynch mob broke into the state penal farm in Milledgeville. You don't see that happen often. Kidnapped the prisoner, drove him back to Marietta, where Mary Fagan was from, and lynched him. And that was in 1915. So,
and that's what made him governor, right? That's what made
him wildly popular. He was seen as a defender of chaste white Southern womanhood, and he swept into the state house with very convincingly, and then in fact was unopposed for his second 2-year term. So he comes into this with a reputation of somebody who could be trusted to uphold the status quo, I think is probably a reasonable way to put it. And instead, during the course of his time in office, he does a slow turn. He does it out of the view of most of the public. And what prompts this 180 in his thinking most likely is just a series of horrific racial crimes that occur on his watch. Most especially a flurry of lynchings that occurred in May of 1918 down in the far southern part of the state, right along its Florida border. And they're just horrific crimes. You cannot dig into these crimes, these May 1918 murders, without being deeply, deeply moved, horrified to your core. They give me the shivers to even think about them. And so anyway, Dorsey surprised the agents by throwing the entire weight of the state of Georgia behind the prosecution by hiring a special prosecutor, arranging his hiring. He couldn't do it himself, and by appointing his own assistant attorney general to be part of the prosecution team. He met with the prosecutor, strategized as to how they could best attack the case. Of course, he was a former prosecutor himself, and was really part of the team. Was a key part of the team in bringing Chyness Williams to trial, because it was unusual for a white man, especially a white man of means, to be brought to trial on the word solely of black witnesses, and for murdering just black.
Right.
Yeah, I sort of two directions to go in from this, but one is, and the governor, does some more things where he seems to be kind of coming out against peonage, against some of the racial violence. And so the first question is sort of like, what is this guy doing? Hello, governor, you're in the South. This is a still in 1921, a pretty racist environment here. Why are you doing this in a different direction? And then the other thing, so that's one question. The other completely unrelated question is, I just wondered if, when you look at how fast they arrested and brought to trial John Williams, do you think that people in the area kind of knew that this guy had gone way off the edge, way beyond what you could justify, and they wanted to kind of hush things up and get him out of the way to kind of avoid being in the spotlight?
I'll take the second question first. I don't remember what the first one was at this point.
I do, so I'll come back to it.
But I think he had the support of most of his neighbors. I don't think they viewed him as a societal problem. I think that there was great surprise that he was prosecuted. And I say that because when he died years later in 1932, he got a write-up in the local paper in Monticello, in the Jasper County seat, the Monticello News, did a story in which he was described as a family man, a great member of the community who was a pillar of his church and a contributor to all municipal betterment, et cetera, et cetera.
Put a footnote in there. Also convicted murderer.
Never mentioned. Never
Murderer.
even a word about
Wow.
what sent him to prison, or that he was in prison for that matter. It was just a little bit of an odd omission. This was a case that it generated so much outrage outside of Georgia that I think that the usual course of justice inside of Georgia was frustrated.
Okay, and so going back to the first part of the question, what the hell was going on with the governor? So yeah, we have some idea that there's some things that are making him change his mind, but this is political suicide. This is you are not going to get any more votes in Georgia taking this position. And I know he didn't leave any diaries. He doesn't leave a letter of explanation. Here's why I did what I did. But what do you think do you think it was simply a matter of conscience welling up and he couldn't help himself? In which case, why is it only him? Why isn't this happening on a more massive scale? Or do you think it's a reflection of that he felt guilty about Frank and that conviction? I mean, what do you think's going on there?
I wish I knew. I have some ideas. I think that he was a very pragmatic guy at his core, and that he recognized that with cases like this generating so much outside publicity and blackening the eye of the state in the eyes of the world, not just the other people in the other states, that Georgia stood a very good chance of being written off as a pariah, not only by the press and the public, but by American business. He saw Georgia being left undeveloped, seen as a backwater. And also ran an American life, and he did not want that to happen. He also. It's important to note that his break from the expected behavior of a white supremacist Southern governor did not end with the John S. Williams case. Emboldened by this case, just a couple weeks later, he issued a public pronouncement called a statement by Governor Hugh M. Dorsey as to the state of the Negro in Georgia, in which he enumerated 135 crimes against Black people that had occurred on his watch, and basically stood up in front of a packed house at a big hotel in Atlanta and told the folks there, look, if we don't change our ways, we are going to be a pariah in the eyes of the world, and rightly so. We will have earned it, and so that. It was that really did him in terms of his political fortunes. That was a the hell with the future kind of act on his part. And before we make too much of the fact that he was never going to be elected again, he was pretty much out of options in terms of election. He could not run for governor a third term without sitting out for 4 years and then coming back. He had just lost the year before a run for the U.S. Senate, and that wasn't, he had lost decisively. So his electoral future was pretty cloudy to begin with. And he may have thought that at that juncture, he was in a unique position. He had very little to lose politically. It was disastrous for him in pretty much every way, socially, financially. It did him in. But it did not stand in the way of him getting elected again.
So, Earl, and kind of on this thought, I mean, he does, and I find it a very interesting thing that he mentions, you talk about in the book, that he says, look, if we want people to invest in Georgia and do all these great things in Georgia, we can't do this. So, that's an argument against this whole system that I hadn't seen made before, which I found very interesting. But how does this case and this story become national news? Right? When does it go from being this odd thing that's happening in Georgia? And now, you're talking about the New York Times and how does this become a global or a national story, and what impact does that have on the case?
Well, I think it becomes it is amplified quite a bit by the leadership of the NAACP.
Right.
Now, just a couple of months before the agents made that first visit to the John S. Williams plantation, the NAACP had acquired its first black leader, its first black executive secretary, James Weldon Johnson.
Yeah.
It's often forgotten that the NAACP was actually created in the main by white Northeastern do-gooders.
Yeah.
And it took until 1920 for them to get their first executive secretary who was black. And James Weldon Johnson is one of the most remarkable figures in American history. He and his lieutenant, Walter White, another amazing figure, really took this story and wouldn't let it die. They were really good with publicity. They understood how to get stories in the newspaper. They understood what newspapers would respond to in terms of the story. They were big on sending telegrams to public officials denouncing one thing or another, and making sure that the contents of those telegrams made their way into print. And that's what they did here. They recognized right away that here was a case that put a human face on peonage, not only for the victims, but also for the perpetrators. Because peonage was usually, it was this shadowy thing. If people were aware of it at all, and I think most Americans had no idea what was going on, it was an abstraction. You didn't see actual people involved in it. And here you had actual people. And so along with the gruesome methodology that Williams used in doing away with these guys, it was the fact that the federal agents and Hugh Dorsey had allies in James Weldon Johnson and Walter F. White, I think, that really propelled this into the upper echelons of the public consciousness.
Right.
So there's national attention. The story is in the New York Times. The NAACP is on it and making a big deal out of it. The governor of Georgia is sort of taking a stand on racism and on peonage. And so this leads to a new era in race relations in America. And okay, well, it doesn't. So why doesn't it? Why you stumbled on this story and you said, oh, here's this thing that nobody knows about. And then you saw all of this stuff that happened, and you must have said, why didn't this kind of lead to a change of some kind? Why does it kind of fold back in and submerge into the depths of history again?
I don't think it did. I think it did have an effect. I think it threw a hard light on the practice that, again, most Americans, most Georgians, I think, had no idea that was taking place. And it became a lot harder to pull off, especially the model that Williams used, in which you bailed prisoners out of local jails. The folks who did that were pretty much forced to stop that immediately. In the immediate years after this happened, it was too hot. And so you can't say that it was without impact. It had an impact, and not only that, but it brought the word into the lexicon, and once it was there, and there was an awareness that this practice existed, people knew to look for it. The cases were prosecuted by the feds with renewed interest. A lot of people went to jail. A lot of people in law enforcement went to jail, and you saw courts suddenly willing to make convictions. It did linger. It especially in the more subtle forms. When peonage was not the style that Williams used, bailing people out. That was not the most prevalent form of peonage. The most prevalent form was baked into sharecropping, and that was, that involved tens of thousands of victims, a huge population. The sharecropping, if it worked the way it was supposed to, meant that you, as a sharecropper, would work for a landlord. You'd live on the landlord's property. He'd give you a chunk of land, and you'd raise crops on that land, and your rent payment was a percentage of the crops that you raised, usually half. Either you give him the crops and he'd go to market and sell them, or you try to sell them yourself and give them half the money. Usually it was the former. He would take the crops to market. Now, the problem with that is that you had to live all year before you got to harvest time and got your payment for the crops you had raised. So the landlord would front you the food, the seed, all the equipment you needed, and then you'd pay him back out of your earnings at the end of the year. The problem was that the landlord, all too often, was not on the up and up. He jacked up the prices that he charged you for the provisions that you needed to live on over the course of the year before harvest. And then he trimmed the value of the crops that you raised. He might be getting $28 a bushel or something for your crops while he's paying you 10. And you have no recourse if that's the case as a black man. If you question his accounting, you question his word, well, that'll get you killed. And you can't leave, because at the end of the year, thanks to these accounting practices, you owe him money instead of, you haven't actually earned anything. You actually wind up in the red, and so it rolls over for a year, and then you repeat the process, and you wind up deeper in debt at the end of the second year. So that's the form. That was the most widespread form of peonage. Was this much more subtle thing, and that took quite a while to finally put to rest. And really, the mechanization of agriculture during and immediately after World War II had a pretty big role in bringing that to an end.
But why do you think it is? I mean, I'm kind of coming to Rick's defense here a bit, which I very seldom do.
Oh, okay. I'm waking up.
But this case is so horrific. Okay, and it at the time it got so much press and attention, but none of my books I ever read about civil rights in college or grad school mention this. We all know about Emmett Till, as we should, or the Freedom Riders, or all these sorts of. This story, why isn't this kind of moment in time, the peonage system, and this case in particular, why is it such a surprise to us now? I mean, that you were shocked by this.
I think it is the fact that it occurred when it did. I mean, look at Tulsa. Right. Look at the race riot in June of 1921 in Tulsa, which is really what knocked this out of the headlines.
Yeah.
That was unknown to most Americans until a couple of years ago when we got to the anniversary.
Right.
Look at the Red Summer of 1919. Any one of those individual white on black race riots that killed hundreds, if not thousands, of people. Right. How much public awareness is there that happened? That black soldiers were attacked for being in uniform after they had been overseas fighting for the cause. This whole period is pretty much a blank, I think.
Yeah, because we had a historian on many years ago, and she talked about this period before the civil rights movement, before we think the civil rights movement started. And again, I'm just curious as to your thoughts as to why this is just a part of that story that just seems to.
Yeah, well, I wish I had an explanation as to why there was this huge gap in my knowledge. I thought I knew 20th century American history pretty well before I stumbled on those stories in the Times. And the fact is, there were decades of American history that were just smudges. They're very vague. And I had never heard of James Weldon Johnson before I started working on this book. And I hang my head in shame about this, because you look into his story and you see that the civil rights movement was not a product of the 50s and 60s. It was well underway in the late teens, thanks to people like Johnson and W.E.B. Du Bois. And so it's, I think that we as a country chose to have very short memories back then about things that we found troubling, and or things perhaps that we didn't find troubling. I don't know how much outrage there was about Tulsa among the American.
I'll tell you what. I'm gonna try to answer your question, Chris, because I've been thinking about this, and I think a lot of this has to do with that the civil rights movement really flowers and comes to bloom in the 50s and 60s has to do with television. I think that somehow people could ignore print articles, they could ignore unsettling photos, but they couldn't ignore footage that's being broadcast into their living room on CBS News, on NBC News, showing riots, showing the police treatment, showing this kind of stuff. And I think that it really, I think suddenly, I think that's what it took for people who might have, responded, previously had they really been appealed to, but for people to say, well, wait a minute, this isn't right. Maybe we should do something about this. Maybe these people who are protesting against it need our support. I mean, I think television is a big part to do with that.
I'd buy that. And also, you got to remember, this is occurring at the same time that Confederate statues are being erected in many southern cities. This is occurring even as there's a renewal, a second run for Birth of a Nation, which had come out 6-7 years before, but now enjoyed a second run through American theaters. So the story reached an audience that was not necessarily sympathetic to the victims. And the other, I think that mass media certainly is a huge piece of it, and there's no substitute for moving pictures from the Edmund Pettus Bridge, for instance. I mean, right. But the
or Sheriff Clark,
Bull Connor or whatever. I mean, you don't get those pictures out of your head. But at the same time, it's even if there had been a better way to more quickly reach a greater piece of the population with a more visceral sort of representation of the news. I don't know that the American public at that point would have responded in the way that we'd like to think they would have. Right. My grandfather was 16 years old when this happened. And one thing this story has prompted me to mull is whether, if I went back through time and ran into him in 1921, whether I'd like the guy I was running into.
Well, another question I had, I know we're getting close to the end, but I was fascinated by, because again, just you raised so many really compelling points, but you were talking about some of the characters that you'd written about so well throughout the book and at the end, and what happened to them. And of course, when people buy your book, they can delve into this a bit more, but you were talking about the process of researching some of the African Americans in the story and how it was very difficult to do. And part of the difficulty lay in their response to this whole system, how they didn't leave traces. And so maybe, you could tell us a little bit about your process and some of the difficulties you encountered, and kind of about that idea.
Well, one of the great things about writing this book now was that I was able to access online records that would have been unavailable to me just a few years ago, and so I had, I was able to use the census with, and to search through the census in a way that just trimmed months of library research out of the process. And when it came time to try to track down some of the descendants of the victims of the peons and the other black laborers on the Williams farm, one of the issues I ran into was that the census itself had very little information about them. It often got their names wrong. They sometimes appeared twice in the same census, and you hear that can't happen. But in 1920, it did happen. I found several cases of it. there just wasn't a lot to go on with the first generation people involved in this thing, let alone people 4 generations down the pike. And but eventually, I was able to use the census primarily and city directories and kind of these old school shoe leather reporting tools to follow people over time as they moved around. The black residents of the plantation scattered right after the trials, and most of them went to Atlanta. A few of them went to other cities, Charlotte. A few of them moved north. There were some that settled in Ohio, and one of the things that further stymied or further complicated the process was that these victims did not talk about what they'd been through. Now, when I researched when I tried to reach the descendants of John S. Williams, I found that many of his descendants grew up with no idea that this had happened. They also scattered. They wound up in Texas and Florida, most of them. And the descendants, they didn't know that Grandpa and that Uncle Leroy was indicted for murder. They didn't know that great grandpa John S. Williams was a serial killer. Basically, they had no clue that had happened. But what was surprising to me was that the black victims kind of responded in the same way. They just kept their mouths shut about what they had been through.
We are near the end, but there's not another show that starts after this, so we can go a moment or two long. What was the reaction? You're talking to Williams family members who maybe don't know much about this or have just heard about it. What was their reaction to, like, oh my God, this guy is going to come and write a book about my relative who I had no idea was a murderer, and now it turns out, probably was.
Well, they knew that he was a murderer by the time I came to them. They had, I think most of them had found out in the 90s and early aughts that this had transpired, and they didn't know much about what had happened. They had the basic outlines of what had occurred, and there might have been a tiny bit of trepidation about having this unknown person writing about their family history, but in the main, I got nothing but cooperation from John S. Williams's descendants, most of whom were as hungry for answers and for understanding as I was. Mm-hmm. They were wonderful, and they're reading the book right now. So I guess we'll find out soon enough, whether they feel their trust was well placed. But in the case of I ran down one grandson of one of the field bosses on the farm. Black worker named Claude Freeman. His grandson, Kenneth Freeman, lives in Akron, Ohio. And he had found out about it probably in the 90s or early aughts as well from relatives of his grandmother, whom he had never met. She died of pellagra in 1929. And he was, he knew what he had heard from his grandmother's relatives, but had heard nothing really to fill in the gaps of his knowledge since. So I got pretty much the same reaction from him. He was hungry for understanding, and he's also reading the book now. So we'll see what he thinks.
Well, Earl Swift, we want to thank you so much for joining us today on History Happy Hour, and mention that your book is called Hell Put to Shame. And you do talk in there a little bit about sources and research, and which is quite fascinating in this story. Yeah. Hell Put to Shame, the 1921 Murder Farm Massacre and the Horror of America's Second Slavery. So lots of details in there that we didn't get into on the trial. Yeah, so you need to buy a copy and look through and find out about this story that we should all know about. So thank you very much for bringing it to our attention.
Chris, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Okay. Well, Chris, we're live again next week.
It's like a twofer.
I know. It's going to be a threefer because we have 3 weeks before we go off into vacation mode again. Yeah. Next week, British military historian Saul David returns to History Happy Hour with a new book about the British airborne in World War II. It's called Sky Warriors and it tells the full story of the British Airborne from its formation in 1940 to Operation Varsity in 1945, which was the largest airborne landing in history. And we know we have some fans here of the 101st Airborne and the 82nd Airborne. And I know Saul says that the British Airborne were some of the finest troops who served in World War II. So
well, we'll grill Saul.
We'll take him on, and we'll force him to back up that
outrageous claim.
That point of view. Tomorrow is the 249th anniversary of the Battle of Lexington. Tomorrow is the reenactment. And when we get to the 250th anniversary, you and I are going to be leading a tour there. I expect that tour to be finally have all the itinerary and stuff posted on the Stephen Ambrose Tours website in the next day or two. We'll talk about that a little bit next week. We'll talk about Saul David next week. And
I also want to slip in that not only is it the anniversary, but it's also tax day.
Yes, it is.
And interesting conclusions can be drawn from that.
You know who I'm going to see tomorrow?
Who are you going to see tomorrow?
Hampton Sides. He's appearing at a bookstore, so I'm going to go up. Marilyn and I are going to go up and
be like a fanboy.
Fawn him. Yes, we are fanboys and girls. Guys, thank you so much for joining us. Please subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Facebook, shout at us on Twitter, listen to our podcast, back us on Patreon, and browse historyhappyhour.com.
Right. Thanks, everybody. Be safe.